Hello, everybody. It's 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get our event started. And I want to start by saying hello, happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and welcome to the Allentown Art Museum's first ever virtual week-long MLK celebration. We're very excited about the lineup of events that we have planned and activities that we have scheduled, and I'm so very honored and excited to kick off our week of live virtual events with our first family story hour, which is going to be with author Pamela Tuck, who's here with us today. I'm going to do a quick introduction and I'm going to pass it over to you, Pamela.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
So, Pamela M. Tuck is an award winning author and mother of 11 children. She's been writing poems and stories since she was a child growing up in Greenville, North Carolina. She is the author of Mother of Many, As Fast as Words Could Fly, Color Struck, and The Adventures of Sheldon the Mushroom. Pamela credits her writing to her upbringing surrounded by Southern storytellers. Her family inspires many of her stories. Although Pamela grew up as an only child, she enjoys the excitement of having a large family. Welcome to MLK Day, Pamela. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you and get our story hour started.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Abigail. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you.
Yes. And hello, everyone. I want to thank you so much for coming out to the MLK Day for the Allentown Art Museum and also allowing me to share my family story. So, as Abigail stated, I am a writer, I'm a children's book author, and I did come from a family of storytellers. So, I'm just going to share my screen really quickly here. And let's see, I'm sorry. All right. And I want to start with how I got started. So, as she mentioned, I came from a family of storytellers, but they were more than just storytellers. My family had a little secret going on. Um, Actually, let me show you when my journey began as a writer. So, this was me when I was about 2 or 3 years old, and my grandfather was a master storyteller in our family. And I would sit down at my grandfather's feet and I would listen to him tell all kinds of stories that would make your eyes pop and your mouths drop. So this next slide shows you the house that Moses built. Now you may ask yourself, well, who is Moses? Moses was my grandfather, and he built that house, and that's where I learned or heard a lot of my family stories and a lot of the stories that he would tell. At the bottom, there's a picture of my grandfather and my grandmother. And yeah, and I said that, I came from a family of storytellers, and growing up, I was an only child, but I had a lot of cousins, and we would sit and listen to my grandfather tell stories about Brer Rabbit, and he told a lot of stories about enslavement. But some of the stories that really stuck with me the most were stories about our family, because our family were also civil rights activists. And we would hear these stories and we would be so engaged because of the way that my grandfather told these stories. And we would sit around his feet at night and hear all of these horror stories. Sometimes they would make us very scared, and we all lived like around my grandmother and grandfather's house. So at night, we're enjoying these stories. And then we realize, uh-oh, we have to go home. And back in Greenville, North Carolina, back in the 70s, we didn't have many street lights. So all of these characters that we heard, my grandfather telling us about, they would come alive in my mind and they were waiting for me outside. So I would run across the yard and get to my house and bang on the door, waiting for my parents to open the door so I could come in. That's how real those stories were that my grandfather told. And even though I found out later that a lot of those stories that my grandfather told were not his own stories, they were made up stories, and some of them were not even true. But the family stories were the ones, like I said, that stuck with me the most. And those were true stories. So today, I would like to share with you one of my family stories. So you may say, well, what is a civil rights activist? Now, some of you may already know what a civil rights activist is. But a civil rights activist, and this is just my own take on it, is a person who fights against social injustice. unfair things that are done to certain groups of people. And civil rights activists believe everyone should have equal rights and privileges. So let's take a look at some of the things that were going on during that time period that were unfair in the days that my dad lived. All right, so looking at this first picture, the top photo shows a young Black girl drinking from a separate water fountain. Back in the 1960s, and maybe some of the 50s, they had segregation. And segregation is when they separated the races. And there were two water fountains. One water fountain was for white people to drink from, and one water fountain was for Black people to drink from. So this was a form of separation. The bottom photo also shows a form of separation. This was a restaurant. And I have arrows because it may be hard to see, but arrows pointing to the white entrance and the Black entrance. So during that time period, my dad and other people like him, my grandfather, and people who lived during the civil rights era, um, they had to enter restaurants. If they were served at all, they would have to enter restaurants from a different entrance. So that was some of the things that they felt like were unfair. Now, another thing that was going on throughout the country during that time period was transportation. If you look at the top picture, you can see that the Black people were sitting in the back of the bus and the white people sat in the front of the bus. Now, this is if the bus was not crowded. As you can see, this bus does not look like it's crowded, over full. Everybody has a seat. But in an event that there were a lot of passengers, and if there were more passengers who were white than Black, then or less passengers, as long as there were seats that the Black people sat in, they would have to give up their seats to any white passenger who needed a seat. So at times, the Black people would have to pay fare to ride the bus. But if a white person needed their seat, they would have to stand, and sometimes they would have to be asked off the bus. So that was something else that was a little, unfair. In the bottom photo, there were buildings and businesses that would not allow Black people to use their services. Now, this was a laundry company, and they publicly advertised that we wash for white people only. So that gives a message to everybody who was not white that you can't go there to have your clothes washed. So these were signs and different things that were done during this time period that people felt like were very unfair. So these civil rights activists decided that they wanted to do something to try to change this. And that's what led into the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement is a form of fighting for change. Some of the steps that were taken during the civil rights movement was school integration. You had the Montgomery bus boycott, and that's when the people just got tired of always having to sit in the back, always having to give up their seats. So they decided to stop riding the buses. And the bus business lost money and things changed. And there were also sit-ins. And sit-ins was when people actually went to restaurants and that wouldn't serve Blacks, and they would just sit at the counter and wait. They didn't expect to be served any food, but they just sat there as a civil disobedience of the law because they were against the law that kept them separate. And then it ventured into Southern University integrations, voting rights, and of course, the fight continues because I feel like the civil rights movement never really ended. So that leads us to some of the famous civil rights historical icons. Now, some of the ones that you may be familiar with, maybe Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which today is MLK Day, so I'm pretty sure you've heard of him. Rosa Parks, she was a part of the Montgomery bus boycott. Ruby Bridges was a little girl who integrated an all-white school. That means that she was one of the first Blacks to start going to a white school in her area. And then we have Malcolm X, who was also a civil rights leader, and his views were slightly different at first from Dr. Martin Luther King's. He believed that, Black people needed to use a little force and not be nonviolent and submissive. And he had his personal views about how to conduct social change. Now, these icons found their way into history books. And it's not because they just said one day, I'm going to make history. It's because they were tired of the unfair ways, the unfair laws, the unfair society that they were living in. And because of that, they had the courage to try to change things. there were a lot of people who participated in the civil rights movement, heroes and heroines that were unknown, because the civil rights movement didn't just take one person or a couple of people. It was a group effort. It was when people came together and they saw what benefits would come about when people joined together in the same mission to create social change. So one of those people was my grandfather and my dad and his brothers. Back in the 1960s, my grandfather, Moses Till, decided to do one of the things that Ruby Bridges' parents did, and Brown versus the Board of Education. You may have heard of that. Well, there were people around the country who were doing similar things. They were encouraged by the movement that others had gone through to integrate schools. So in the 1960s, my grandfather decided that he would sue the school board, Pitt County Board of Education, because he couldn't understand why his children and other Black children in the area had to be bused miles and miles away from their home to go to a school that was not as good as the local schools that were close by. And the reason for this was because the local schools were for all white students. The schools that they were bused to were for all Black students. Some of these schools didn't have heat. Some of them had inferior textbooks. They didn't give the proper education that they were getting at the white schools. No playground equipment sometimes, just unfair in every way. So my grandfather got tired of that, and he felt like every child deserved a right to quality education. So he sued the school board so that his children and other Black children in the community could start going to the better schools. Now, this picture is a picture of my dad, Moses Till Jr., and he's at the top right side of the screen. He was the youngest of the three brothers. Those were his brothers. To the far left of the screen is his oldest brother, William Till. The middle was Harry Till, and that's the brother who my grandfather actually filed a lawsuit in the name of. And then, as I said, the right top picture is a picture of my dad, Moses Till. So they were teenagers when they wanted to attend high school in Belleville, Falkland. And this was Belleville Falkland High School, the picture in the middle. And that school looks like a very nice building, strong. It wasn't dilapidated like some of the Black schools. But that building was filled with the students that you see below. Now, these weren't the actual students who attended that school, but this is a picture of what the students looked like back in the 1960s. But that building was filled with white students. And so my dad and his brothers had the courage to start that movement of integrating an all-white school. So I grew up hearing this story. And as a children's book writer, I wanted to break into the children's book industry. So I said, I wanted to find out how I could write for children. So I joined the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. In the meantime, my husband actually looked up different publishing houses, and he found a company called Lee and Low. Now, Lee and Low Books, they were offering a New Voices Award, which was a writing contest. And they wanted writers of color to tell their unique stories. And they wanted stories that had not been told before, underrepresented stories. And so my husband said, well, why don't you write your dad's story about how he integrated the all-white school? And I was like, no, that's too complicated. That's too complicated of a story to put into a picture book. And so my husband said, try. So in trying to figure out how to write my dad's story, I actually went to the library and I checked out books, and I looked up books that had actually won the New Voices Award contest from Lee and Low in years prior. So this book, 16 Years and 16 Seconds, it's the Sammy Lee story by Paula Yu. It fit what I wanted to write. I wanted to write a civil rights story. And this story was about an Asian American who wanted to be an Olympic swimmer, a diver. And he went through similar unfair treatment that my dad went through. He wasn't allowed to go to the pools on certain days, and he had to practice diving in a sand pit because he wasn't allowed to go to the pool to practice. But he became a gold medal Olympic swimmer and diver. So Paula Yu won this award in 2003. So I used her book as a model, as a reference, so I could write my dad's story. So in revisiting my dad, I heard this story growing up And he often reminded me when I complained about going to school and having homework and things like that. He often said, a lot of people had to make a lot of sacrifices for you to have the privileges that you have. And even though I heard his stories growing up in full and in snippets when I complained, I went back to him as a writer and I wanted to see how I could capture his story in the form of a picture book. And so the top left picture shows a little boy, a little black boy at a typewriter. So my dad had a typing talent that I knew about. And then the top right picture shows a school library. I knew that my dad, once he entered the all white school, he was offered a job, not right away, but he ended up getting a job in the school library through the youth corps. The bottom left picture shows a tobacco field. Now you're probably saying, well, how does a tobacco field play into civil rights? Well, it doesn't really play into civil rights, but it plays into my story because I use that because that's what my dad did during the summer. He worked in the tobacco field, but I use that to kind of show his character and how even though he had to work hard during the summers, he never let that tire him or stop him from practicing his typing. So that showed determination. So I use that in the story just to build my character development. And the bottom right picture is another historical character that a lot of people may not know of. And his name is Golden Franks. Now, Golden Franks was a field secretary for the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he was personally selected by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to represent that area where my dad lived. So when anyone complained about unfair treatment, Dr. Golden Franks would actually form a march, a sit-in, or protest, or investigate to get justice. So I took all those elements that I knew from my dad's story, and I tried to write it based on the book that had already won the New Voices Award contest. And so I submitted the story in September 2007. And in December 2007, I was told that I won the award. So I would like to share with you today my story, As Fast as Words Could Fly. It's a 2007 New Voices Award winner for Lee and Low. And it's my dad's journey of how he desegregated the school systems back in the 1960s and how he used his typing talent to help break racial barriers. Now, during that time period, like I said, there was a lot of unfairness going on. And we're so many years past that point now. And I want to say that instead of me reading the story to you, which I would love to do, but I have a more engaging way to share the story with you. In 2017, the SAG-AFTRA Foundation chose As Fast as Words Could Fly, my dad's story, to present on a literacy website called Storyline Online. And so I'm going to let actor Dule Hill read the story to you. This is such an honor, and it gives great tribute to my dad and the fight and the struggle that he went through during that time period. So I'm going to stop sharing this PowerPoint, and hopefully you can see As Fast as Words Could Fly. I'm going to play this video for you now.
Welcome to Storyline Online, brought to you by the SAG-AFTRA Foundation. I'm Dule Hill, and today I'm going to read As Fast as Words Could Fly, written by Pamela M. Tuck and illustrated by Eric Velasquez. You ready? Here we go. Trouble was brewing in Greenville, North Carolina. By 5 o'clock, 14-year-old Mason Steele was rushing to finish his schoolwork. Pa would be home from his meeting soon, bringing a new problem. New problems meant more work for Mason. He didn't mind, though, because helping Pa's civil rights group made Mason feel real important. The screen door banged shut. "Where's Mason?" Pa asked as he scanned the kitchen. "Willis, the boy's doing his lessons." Ma sighed. "I need him to write another letter for me. Mason!" "Yes, sir," Mason called. He hurried into the room with paper and a pencil. "Whitaker's restaurant refused to serve Matt Duncan's boys," Pa explained. "We gotta form another sit-in." Mason took notes while Pa rambled. Only Mason could make sense out of what Pa said. Later, Mason turned his notes into a business letter. This sounds good enough to send to President Lyndon B. Johnson himself, Pa boasted after he read Mason's letter. One evening, after the screen door banged shut, Mason waited for Pa to call him. Instead, he heard Ma and Pa talking quietly. When Mason finally entered the kitchen, he could hardly believe his eyes. A typewriter, he gasped. Yup, Pa said. The group wanted to give it to you. Said you've been quite a little lawyer for us. Figured a typewriter might help you someday. Mason slid his fingers over the keys. Each row looked like little steps climbing up. It's beautiful, Mason whispered. I'll type the civil rights group a thank you letter. That'll be the right thing to do, Ma agreed. Soon, school was out. During the summer, Mason and his two older brothers, Willis Jr. and Henry, picked tobacco with a few of the white boys who lived nearby. Patrick and Daniel Jones were the only two who acted friendly. They often raced against Mason and his brothers to be the first to fill the mule cart. In the evenings, Mason was weary from the day's work, but that didn't stop him from practicing his typing. Using his index fingers to pick out the keys, he learned where every letter and symbol was located on the typewriter. Summer flew by. Before he knew it, Mason started his first year of high school. After the third week, Pa called him and his brothers into the kitchen one evening. Boys, I got some real important news for you, he began. We just won a case we've been fighting for a long time. It ain't right for y'all to be bused 12 miles to Bethel Union High School when Belvoir High ain't but 3 miles away. The boy's eyes widened. Pa, you know them white boys ain't gonna like us going to their school, not one bit, Willis Jr. stammered. Like it or not, y'all's going, Pa replied. Somebody's gotta make a change. The boys stared at one another in disbelief. The bus will be here early Monday morning, so be ready, Pa said as he got up from the table and left the room. Monday morning, Mason and his brothers were nervous. They watched the school bus come roaring up the road. The driver slowed down just enough for the boys to see the white students on the bus laughing at them. Then he sped up, blowing dust in the boys' faces. They just don't want us on their bus, Willis Jr. said. I don't want to ride their bus no ways, Mason added. The boys trudged back to the house. When they told Pa the driver hadn't stopped for them, he was furious. The next day, the same thing happened. The third day, the bus stopped. Slowly, the boys climbed the steps. Move it! I ain't got all day, the driver yelled. And get to the back. The boys stumbled over one another as they hustled down the aisle. Henry spotted a familiar face. Hey, Patrick, he said. Patrick didn't answer. He just looked straight ahead. You still boys asking for trouble, Daniel whispered. The driver took off. The sudden motion threw the boys into their seats. When the boys arrived at Belvoir High, the principal, Mr. Bullock, barricaded the doorway. He looked as if he had smelled a skunk. Report to class after the bell rings, he snapped, and thrust their schedules toward them. How will we know where to go? Willis Jr. asked. You found a way to get in here, so find your way around. Mr. Bullock turned and stormed into the building. By the time Mason located the right room, the class had already started. Cold stares and grimaces greeted him when he entered. Mason knew which seat was his, the one in the back corner. Against the odds, Mason did well in school. He especially liked typing class. The teacher, Mrs. Roberts, ignored him, but he paid strict attention when she helped others. At home, Mason practiced what he had learned. It wasn't long before he needed to earn some money to buy typing paper and other supplies. Mason found out that the Neighborhood Youth Corps sponsored an after-school program that offered jobs. He applied and received a position in the school library. "What can you do, boy?" Mrs. Turner, the librarian, asked. "I can type, ma'am," Mason answered. "Well, come over here so I can show you what to do." Mrs. Turner took a stack of index cards and sat down at a typewriter. "Pay attention, because I'm not going over this with you a second time." Mason had to transfer the information on the spines of the books onto the cards. Mrs. Turner typed one card and left him without further instructions. 2 hours later, Mrs. Turner approached Mason. "How's it coming, boy?" she demanded. Mason handed her his stack of index cards. Mrs. Turner's eyes bulged. "My goodness! How many cards did you type?" "I think about 100, ma'am," Mason replied. Mrs. Turner checked the cards. She couldn't find a single mistake. "Gracious boy," she said. "You type faster than Mrs. Roberts." Mrs. Roberts was pleased to be relieved from the library work. She became friendlier to Mason in typing class. She even allowed him to use the new electric typewriter. The first time Mason used the electric typewriter, the letters jumped onto the paper with the slightest touch. He had to get used to pressing a button to return to the left margin of his paper. He could type faster and more quietly on the electric typewriter. But he missed the tinkling bell on the manual typewriter that signaled the new line. Mason continued to improve his typing skills. Before long, he could type 40 words per minute. His job was going well too, and he was earning the money he needed for typing supplies. Then, Mason was fired without explanation. "They done messed with the wrong fella." Pa fumed when he found out what had happened. "I'm gonna call Golden Frinks on this one. He's a field secretary for the SCLC." Mason had heard plenty of Pa's stories about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that coordinated nonviolent action to end segregation. Pa had said that field secretaries interviewed people who complained about unequal treatment. Then he organized a march, a sit-in, or a protest. Golden Frinks was personally selected by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Pa added. "And believe me, son, Mr. Frinks shakes ground." The next morning, Golden Frinks, Pa, and other civil rights workers went to the Board of Education. An investigation began. The Board of Education discovered that Mrs. Turner's husband didn't want her to stay after school with a Negro boy. The federal government was funding the Youth Corps and now threatened to stop giving the school money for the program because Mason was treated unfairly. Mason was rehired. One day in typing class, Mrs. Roberts announced there was going to be a typing tournament among some of the high schools in the county. The fastest typist in the class would represent Belvoir High. The students fiercely competed against one another. Mr. Bullock reviewed the scores. Then he announced the winner. Mason Steele will represent our school in the typing tournament. "How can a Negro represent our school?" a student blurted out. "We can't afford any more trouble with the Board of Education," Mr. Bullock responded, stealing a glance at Mason. "Do I really want to do this?" Mason thought. But then he recalled Pa's words. Somebody's got to make a change. On the day of the tournament, Mr. Bullock and Mrs. Roberts drove Mason to Farmville High School. Upon entering the auditorium, Mason scanned the room. He tried to ignore the stares of the white students as he considered the selection of electric and manual typewriters. Mason knew if he chose a manual typewriter, he would lose time. He would have to take his left hand off the keys so he could hit the lever to start each new line. All the other students sat down at electric typewriters. Mason had to make a decision. He closed his eyes to think. His typewriter at home flashed before him. Mason sat down at the manual typewriter. The judge went over the rules, then shouted, "Begin!" Ding! Mason finished his first line. He couldn't hear how fast the other students were typing. He focused only on his paper. Ding! Ding! Mason's fingers flew over the keys. His typing echoed throughout the auditorium. Bzzz! Time's up, the judge yelled. All eyes were on Mason as the judge collected the papers. After a long wait, the results were announced. "I can't believe this. I really can't believe this," the judge said into the microphone. Mason Steele from Belvoir High has broken all previous records with a typing speed of 65 words per minute. No one cheered. Mason just stared straight ahead. Mr. Bullock accepted the typing championship plaque for Belvoir High. Not a single person in the audience applauded. Mason received nothing. "That's some skill you have, boy," Mrs. Roberts complimented Mason on the drive back to school. "Thank you, ma'am," Mason responded. "I just have one question," Mr. Bullock said. "Why in the world did you choose a manual typewriter?" Mason cleared his throat. "'Cause it reminds me of where I come from, sir." Neither of the adults said anything more to Mason for the rest of the way. But Mason knew his words, typed on that paper, had already spoken for him. Loud and clear. The end. This is a great book. What I love about this book is, yes, words do matter, but actions matter that much more. Mason's father and the civil rights group gave him a little gift of a typewriter, but Mason received that gift, worked that gift, and in the end, used that gift to change the minds of others. He didn't need to talk about it, he just had to do it. So no matter what people think about you, what they say about you, you don't always need to respond. Just do you. Live your life just like Mason. Thank you for watching Storyline Online. Make sure to check out all of our stories. Keep watching and keep on reading. See you soon.
So that concludes the story of As Fast as Words Could Fly, and I hope you all enjoyed that. My dad's participation in the civil rights movement as a teen. Now I'm going to turn the program back over to Abigail. So if there are any questions or anything that anyone would like to find out more about, what was true, what was false, about being a writer, about being a mom of 11 children, just let me know.
So, Pamela, I'd like to ask you a quick question. For anyone who wants to start writing their own story and sharing their life experiences, what advice do you have to young writers?
Well, that's a good question. My advice to a young writer, especially if you like to write, is just to read the books in the genre. That means the category, like mystery, science fiction, historical fiction, fiction, fantasy, whatever story you have in mind to write. It's a good idea to read books that are similar to that or in that category. And that way you can see, like I told you in my journey, I wanted to write my dad's story. Even though I had the story, I knew the story in my mind and I had the story, I wanted to find out the best way to bring that story out in a very clear, engaging way. And so I found a story that Lee and Low had published that was similar. They have a lot of books, but I found a story that was similar to the topic and the journey that my dad went through. Paula Yu's story, 16 years and 16 seconds. And I read that. It's a great story. And I read it, for entertainment, but I also read it to see how the author developed her character, how she developed her plot. And I found little tricks in there, a reflective phrase. And when I say reflective phrase, I mean, like there was something you have to give, well, you don't have to, but I wanted to give my character something, an inspirational, motivational phrase. Somebody's got to make a change. Paul said that in the beginning of the story. And then by the end of the story, after Mason had gone through all of his obstacles, all of his trials, he was wondering, do I really want to do this? And that phrase came back to him in the end. And he remembered Paul's words, somebody's got to make a change. And that inspired him. So I learned that just by reading Paula Yu's story. I said, oh, wow, I like that. It refers you back. So even though you can write a story, sometimes you can learn craft. You can learn how to make that story better by reading other books in that same genre that had already made it to the market, right? That's where you want to go. So the thing to do is to get those books that have made it and read those books. And then you can find little ways to kind of pattern your story after that, not copying it because you have your own voice, but at least using it as a guide.
Well, thank you so much, Pamela. If anyone else has questions, feel free to put them into the chat. We have a few minutes left here. But I just want to say thank you so much, Pamela, for sharing your family story, for sharing your dad's story via your book. It was so wonderful to get to watch and get to experience with you. And I think that phrase, someone's got to make a change, is just a key point here. It's just such an inspirational phrase and something that we're looking to heighten during our MLK week-long celebration. Is we want to reflect. We're going to do reflection, empathy, activism, volunteerism. Someone's got to make a change, and we can be those people. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted us to be our own heroes in our own communities, just like your dad and your grandfather. And it's an amazing story. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, well, thank you. And it's funny that you would say that because, and talking to my dad further and finding out, why did you do it? I mean, how could you go to a place that you weren't wanted, the courage and everything? He actually said that. Greenville, North Carolina was a small town at one time, but Dr. Martin Luther King came to a bigger city that was near Greenville, North Carolina. And that's what my dad said. He said he was able to hear him speak. And he told everyone in the audience, go back to your own communities and make a change. And so even though my dad was in a small area, that people probably never heard of, a small school that he was trying to integrate people that probably never heard of, he knew that he was taking part of a bigger movement. And that encouraged him that, it was a collective effort. It was a collaborative effort, of everyone who had the same vision. We have to work together, even though it may not have been seen nationally. His little part made a change in his area.
That's amazing. That's an amazing message, and something I think that we can all take with us and put into action, that we all want a more equitable and inclusive world. And I want to say thank you. I'm seeing thank yous coming in through the chat.
Thank you.
Joining us, Pamela. I also want to say thank you so much for all of the wonderful folks who joined us for this event today. We do have more stuff coming up today. We have an artist workshop from 12 to 1 on Facebook. We also have our NAACP honorary performance with the Philadelphia Dance Company coming up later today, and a whole lineup of exciting events for this week. Please, please, please visit our website if you want to learn more at allentownartmuseum.org. But before we sign off, I do see a question here for you, Pamela. It says, how long did it take before more widespread integration took place at your father's school?
Yes, actually, the Civil Rights Act had already been passed. And so that change should have taken place. But some of the Southern schools were a little stubborn, and they had the attitude, come make me, type of attitude, even though they were told to integrate. So some of them were a little slower. After my grandfather filed the lawsuit, it took a little time. I mean, it happened a little quicker in the story because it's historical fiction. It's based off my dad's story. A lot of the things that happened in the story were true, but because of the gaps in time, I had to move the story along a little quicker. I think once my grandfather won that lawsuit, my father and his brothers and other children in the community were able to integrate. Pitt County schools were forced to integrate immediately. And so once they won the lawsuit, they had to open their doors up to Black students. Now, it was up to the Black families to see if they wanted to actually send their children to this school, but they did have to open up the doors. And so some of the children, like my dad and some of the neighborhood children, African-American children, who had the courage to take that step and actually go to the schools. As soon as the lawsuit was won, it may have taken, I can't remember exactly, but it may have taken a little time for them to actually open the doors. But yeah, once the doors were opened, then they had to accept whatever students wanted to attend. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, we have time for one more. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to put those into the chat or the Q&A. Again, just seeing more thank yous to you, Pamela.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. And you know, this is so great, Abigail, because you know, in the story you see that my dad didn't receive any recognition, any honor for winning the Taiping tournament. But I just want to let you all know that my dad is still alive, and I tell him about events that I'm doing and sharing his book, and I can just hear the pride coming through the phone. So this thank you, the applause, and just the, you know, people being interested in his story is giving him the long overdue recognition that he didn't get all those years ago. So thank you.
Well, I mean, honestly, your dad's story is such an inspirational one, and I appreciate the courage that it took for him and your grandfather to do to take those big steps at that time. And I appreciate you for sharing this story, because this is how it continues. This is how we get inspired to keep going and keep fighting for equality and for inclusion in our own communities, in our own country. So, thank you, Pamela. It was great having you here.
Oh, wonderful being here anytime.
All right. So I don't see any more questions, but thank you all so much for joining us today. This has been really wonderful. I hope to see you again at one of our events happening either later today or later this week. Again, check out our website for more information, and happy MLK Day to everyone.
Yes, happy MLK Day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.